My name's Isa, and I'm a bookseller and the subscriptions coordinator with PNP, where we now host in person and virtual events along with trips, classes, and book subscriptions, which you can now check out on our website, politics-prose.com. So before we get into it, I'd like to do some housekeeping. First, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. Second, when we get to the time for opening the floor for your questions, we have placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. Please line up at one of these mics so that everyone can hear you and can hear your question. We also want that question to be heard in our recording of the event, and we are filming tonight's talk and keeping it online so that you or anyone you know can find it on the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we will have a signing up here at this table. So if you have not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind our registers at the front of the store. Our excellent events team will ask you to line up starting here at the pillar and come by to ask your name for personalization. So please have your books ready for us. And once the event is complete, we would like to ask you to fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So without further ado, tonight I'm excited to welcome Efrén C. Olivares, where he'll be talking about his poignant new work, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines. This book reflects on the immigrant experience then and now, on what separations do to families, and how the act of separation itself adds another layer to the immigrant identity. By examining his own personal story and the stories of the families he represents side by side, Olivares meaningfully engages readers with their own assumptions about what nationhood means in America and challenges us to question our own empathy and compassion. Mr. Olivares is the Deputy Legal Director of the Immigrant Justice Project at Southern Poverty Law Center. He was the lead lawyer in successful landmark petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on behalf of families separated under the zero tolerance policy. He previously directed the Racial and Economic Justice Program at the Texas Civil Rights Project, and his writings on immigration policy have also been published by the New York Times, USA Today, and Newsweek, and he has testified before Congress and at briefings on Capitol Hill about immigration and border policies. Part of his work representing separated families was featured in the CBS News documentary, The Faces of Family Separation, released in October 2019, and he has also been interviewed as an expert attorney on immigrants' rights issues on numerous TV and radio shows. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Efrén C. Olivares to PNP.
Thank you. Thank you, Isa, for the introduction, and thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting and for this event. Thank you all for being here. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces of former colleagues and current colleagues and friends. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping that this can be an informal conversation, and I think the most interesting pieces come out during the dialogue and the Q&A. So if anyone feels comfortable, just feel free to raise your hand even during the remarks, and at the end I'll leave time for Q&A. But what I thought I would do tonight is give an overview of how this book came about and read a few excerpts that I think convey part of the message that I hope this book gives to the readers, and some of the takeaways that I am trying to get at with the book. So I'm currently with the Southern Poverty Law Center, directing our Immigrant Justice Project. And before that, I was at a smaller organization in Texas called the Texas Civil Rights Project. And that organization does a variety of work related to voting rights, criminal justice reform, and immigration and border issues. And the focus on immigration and border rights issues really started in 2016. A certain election that year might explain that shift in focus to the border issues. But in 2018, we I would say fortuitously and almost accidentally, ended up being at the epicenter of the family separation crisis. In May of 2018, I received a phone call from one of the federal public defenders in the city of McAllen, Texas, which is right on the border with Mexico. And the federal public defender, who I hardly knew, she represented immigrants who were being charged with a misdemeanor for crossing the border, what's called between ports of entry. So if you cross the border, not at an official port of entry, but through the river or the desert, you're charged with a minor crime. It's a misdemeanor, maximum of $250 fine and up to 6 months in prison. But everyone who gets charged with that misdemeanor historically always gets time served. And what that means is that if you were arrested 2 days ago, your sentence is 2 days, and then you already completed your sentence. And typically, up until that point, people would be released and would face their immigration case. What was happening in May of 2018 was that adults who were traveling with a child were being separated from their child. So they then would come to the hearing to federal court and were telling the criminal defense attorneys that they had been separated from a child and asking where that child might be. And this is before this made any news. We were still trying to figure out what was happening. And this criminal defense attorney asked me if we could do something about it, if we could try to stop it or assist in any way. And I asked her if she could sign an affidavit that we could then use in some sort of legal action. She said she couldn't do that because these were her clients, so that there were attorney-client privilege issues, but that I was free to come to court and interview the parents. So the very next day, at 7:30 in the morning, we went to the courthouse, and I had been in that courtroom many times before, but that morning, it was unlike anything I have ever seen, and I had ever seen up to that point. The courtroom is probably as wide as this room, and there were 6 benches towards the back where typically the public who wants to observe a case would sit. But this morning, they were packed with men and women of all ages in handcuffs, in shackles, and then with a chain around their waist, tired, sleep deprived, and confused about what was happening. Most of them think that they're there to see the immigration judge, that the judge that they're about to see that morning will decide their immigration case, when in fact this was something completely separate. It was this criminal charge for crossing the border. And we asked how many of them had been separated from their children, had been traveling with a child. And that morning, 5 of them raised their hand as they could, being handcuffed. Some of them had to stand up in order to indicate that they had been separated from a child. And in that chaotic scene, we started interviewing them in the corner, trying to get as much information as we could. What was the name of your child? Where were date of birth and country of origin? Any immigration lawyers in the room will know name, date of birth, and country of origin is the key to identifying a person in the immigration system. And we quickly learned that we were the only ones tracking that information. Because the government, at least in one courthouse in McAllen, the government was not keeping track of which child was traveling with which adult. The order had come down to separate, and that's what they were doing. Normally, the adult would come to court, complete their criminal hearing, and then be sent back to the Border Patrol station for processing and so on and so forth, depending on the specific circumstances. And many of them, we learned right away, had been led to believe that their children were waiting for them at the Border Patrol station. But there was this legal fiction that happened that the moment the parent was taken to court, the child was deemed unaccompanied by the immigration authorities, so then they were transferred to a shelter under another jurisdiction, under another agency, another department completely. Over the next 5 weeks, we went to court every day. There was a morning shift and an afternoon shift. And in a single courthouse at the border in McAllen, we interviewed 382 parents separated from their children. Most of them had only one child, but some of them had 2. One of the mothers we interviewed that first day was traveling with her 3 children. And you have seen the headlines and have heard all about family separation and how that went down that summer. But what I did not realize that summer, and it would take me many months to connect the dots, is that but for a couple of decades, I could have been one of the children separated from my parents. About 8 months after that summer, in the spring of 2018, I was giving a presentation to first-generation college students at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And in reflecting about my own experience as a first-generation college student in the US and my experience coming to the US, that was the first time that I started to connect the dots. When I was 9 years old, I was living in a small town in Allende, Nuevo León, northern Mexico, about 3.5 hours from the Texas border. And my father moved to Texas looking for work. He had been a truck driver, and he found a job as a school bus driver in Texas. And for the next 4 years, he was living in McAllen, and my mom, my siblings, and I were living in Allende. And we would only see him, a weekend a month, or a weekend every few weeks when he was able to visit us. We couldn't visit him because we didn't have the right documents to visit him. And I never thought of my own experience, not having my dad around between the ages of 9 and 13, what that did to me, to my mother. Only in writing this book did I start reflecting on, we talk a lot about the experience of the people who come to the US looking for work or escaping violence and persecution, but we don't always talk enough about those who stay behind, the family members who stay behind, and what it's like. And it was frankly not until I was writing this book that I reflected about how hard it was for my mother to raise 2 children on her own, trying to make ends meet. She would sell Cokes out of our little fridge at home until the next time that my father visited. And we didn't have him around for, at the dinner table on a daily basis. Didn't have him around for a medical emergency, which happened with my brother, for school milestones. And I never thought of that as a family separation or as something particularly difficult in my childhood. It was just the way life was. As a child, it is what it is. And, my friends' dads or parents would go to work. My dad just went to work to McAllen and came back 3 weeks later. But it was only once that experience of representing immigrant families that I started reflecting on that and seeing the common points and the parallels of the immigrant experience. And I cannot tell you how many people have reached out to me and shared their own story of family separation. Colleagues at my current job who was like, actually, you know what? I never thought of it that way, but when I was 9 years old, my mom moved and the lawyer filed the wrong document. It was supposed to be a 3-day thing, and it ended up being a 3-year separation. It's extremely common in the immigrant experience. I have learned, and I continue to learn. And I would like to read a couple of passages from the book. The first one is when I was about to graduate from 6th grade. So in Mexico, elementary school is up to 6th grade. So there's elementary school graduation. And I had taken this test and won the award of the top student in 6th grade. So I really wanted my father to be there for that. And that is the scene of this passage. In the weeks leading up to the graduation, I worried constantly about whether my father would be able to attend. I never asked, of course. I had been taught not to be so imprudent. But I wondered every day whether he would be there to see me receive my certificate. My worry was not really whether he would make a special trip to attend the graduation, because I didn't allow myself that possibility. Rather, I anguished, hoping the graduation would fall on a Friday when he was already scheduled to visit. Many mornings in school, I stared longingly at the calendar hanging from our classroom wall, counting the Fridays that were left before graduation, doing my best to calculate, trying to see how things were looking, but since his visits were not always regular, I couldn't be sure. If my mother asked him to come, I never heard that conversation. If he made a special, unscheduled trip, I never found out. But to my great relief, my father traveled home the Friday of my graduation. He had missed both the school field trip the week before and the mass earlier that afternoon, but he made it to the ceremony in the evening, and he saw me receive my certificate. And to me, that was what really mattered. That, as I was saying, that particular memory is perhaps the one memory I have of thinking when I was 12 years old that I wish my father were around and that it was hard not having him around. But a lot of the other memories that I share here, I did not realize until I was an adult that it had been so different. And one thing that may have contributed to that, I think, is that in some ways, it was as if my dad hadn't left. Some of his clothes were in his room, his shoes, his guitar, his tools, but he wasn't there. So it was this very strange situation that in some ways he was there, and in some ways he very much was not there. And what my mother had to do to make things as, I don't want to say normal, but perhaps as happy as possible for her children, is what this other passage is about. And it's in a chapter where I'm talking about how in some ways he was there and in some ways he really wasn't there. And it was confusing. Like, is he around or is he not around? Is kind of the context in which this next passage comes up. That he was indeed gone was most noticeable in the evenings when my mother tried to bolster our spirits by making what she pronounced was our favorite dinner dish, parecitos de manteca, little pears of beef tallow. These pears were a simple yet delicious concoction. Take 2 tortillas, rub some beef tallow on each of them, maybe get lucky and include a few tiny crumbs of the beef that sank to the bottom when the broth was separated from the tallow. Pair them together and warm them up in the comal, a thin griddle used to cook and warm tortillas. Be sure not to leave them on for too long, because the tortillas might get toasted, becoming hard and crispy, and no one wants that. They are meant to be rolled into a long and tight taquito, evenly distributing the grease. The tallow should be fully melted and the tortillas piping hot, but still soft enough to be able to roll them. Sometimes the tallow would fall out of the tortilla into the comal, releasing a hiss of steam and a wonderful smell that tempted my brother and me as we waited, shirtless, seated at the round kitchen table. We dined on these little pieces of heaven a couple of times a week, and some weeks more often, when my dad hadn't come home for a while. On the rare weekends when he returned, bringing chicken and bread and bologna for sandwiches, my mom did not need to get as creative in the kitchen. As I was writing the book and reflecting about my experience, I also became very curious about the history of immigration policy in the US, in particular with respect to families. How have immigrant families been treated in the past? It was not uncommon to hear in 2018, this is not who we are as a country, this is an unprecedented crisis, the first time that something like this had happened. And I started doing some research on that, and somewhat to my surprise, family separation of non-white immigrants has been more common in this country than we would like to acknowledge. From the 1870s with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the reasons that were given for explicitly, it's the only law to this day that in its title has a racial or ethnic population that is explicitly excluded. Even in the early 20th century, with Ellis Island and the influx of immigrants and refugees, children were turned away, children were put in cages. During the Second World War, Japanese Americans, citizens and immigrants alike, were incarcerated, interned, and family separation was a result. And time and again, we see the same arguments about immigrants coming to this country. If you look at the newspapers and news reporting from the 1800s with respect to Chinese and other Asian immigrants, or the early 1900s with respect to Italian and Irish immigrants or Japanese Americans, they're bringing disease, they're bringing crime, they're taking away our jobs. It's the same scapegoating time and again. So when I hear those arguments today, it takes me back to the history of immigration policy in this country that has been time and again, and this is the third thread of the book, that this historical perspective of the immigration policies that we have seen that have been intentionally designed to perpetuate an idea of this country that is no longer true, that this country is exclusively for white people. That is no longer true. May have been true in the past for some people. It's some people's idea of what this country should be, but it is not the reality, and it's very difficult for some people to accept that. Isa was saying during the introduction that the empathy and compassion as one of the themes of this book, and that is one thing that I came to realize. Even in 2018, you all might remember that in June, towards the end of June, when the crisis was growing and brewing, there was an audio of children crying at a detention center that was made public. You know, we had been doing this for weeks, trying to share stories of the families, of what the parents were telling us, to no avail, right? It was not working. Nothing was working. People were still, taking the position that it was the parents' fault. They decided to cross the border illegally. If they didn't want to be separated, they shouldn't have brought their children. We were hearing those arguments constantly. But and for weeks, we had been thinking, somebody's gonna have to leak a photo, a video. One of the agents has gotta have a conscience and leak something that's gonna turn the tide. And it was only an audio that ended up being leaked. And it was so powerful, and it turned the public opinion, even from those who previously had supported the policy, against it. And the reason I think it was such a powerful moment is because when you hear the children crying, 2, 3-year-olds crying for their mom or their dad, and you don't see the color of their skin, it's not so easy to other them, because all children cry the same. And you think those could be my children, those could be my grandchildren, or that could be me when I was a child. And that got me thinking about the power of empathy and compassion and the limits that we construct around it. Why were the cries of those children so powerful in a way that the cries of their parents hadn't been? Why do we feel empathy and compassion for certain people but not for others? Now I even ask myself those questions, right? What artificial, arbitrary reasons do we give ourselves to other somebody? Skin color, language, place of birth, immigration status? For those of us who believe in human rights, none of those things should matter. And it took an audio to deliver that message in a visceral way that I don't think a photo or a video could have done, because that would have allowed people to other them. If you look at somebody that looks different than you, it's so much easier not to consider them human in the same way that we think of ourselves. The last bit I want to read is from that first day in court when we were interviewing the parents. And I skipped over the legal strategy at the time, but we weren't sure what we were going to do legally. What was being done in the criminal context was legal. The parents had crossed the border between ports of entry. It was likely that they had committed this misdemeanor. On the immigration side, they might claim asylum and go through that process, and they were placed in this expedited removal process, which is a summary deportation process that had already been upheld in courts. So challenging that also in the immigration space seemed difficult. But there was still something very visceral, like from the human rights perspective. It just didn't seem right that taking the parents away from the children and the children away from the parents just was not right. And what we were trying to do was get the declarations from the parents that we were writing up in a few minutes that morning to try to submit to some human rights type of complaint that we still hadn't figured out what it was going to be. And this excerpt is from one of those interviews with one of the separated parents on that first day. I was speaking to Leonel, who was also from Guatemala. He was less than a year younger than me and wore a plaid short sleeve shirt, white with dark and light blue lines, and cowboy style buttons, the kind you snap together. He must have been no taller than 5 feet 7 inches. In broken Spanish, he explained that he had come with his 11-year-old son, Daniel. Like Viviana and Sandro, another family, they were traveling alone and they were inseparable. He and Daniel were both first-time crossers and had no family in the United States. They were hoping to apply for asylum due to the persecution they had faced in their indigenous village. I got all the critical information from Leonel, but I still couldn't believe that the agents had not given him any information about his son, where he was being taken, or who would take care of him. Surely the agents must have told him something about the process and about what to expect, I thought. What do you think would happen, I asked Leonel, if you are deported and your son doesn't go with you, if he stays here? He looked down as if thinking about it, and when he looked up, he shook his head. His look was one of resignation. No, pues, mi niño se muere de tristeza. My boy will die of sorrow. For a second, my eyes didn't leave his. I struggled to write down what he was telling me. I pursed my lips and looked down, swallowed hard, and couldn't find words to respond. I read the narrative back to Leonel, and when he agreed that it was accurate, he signed his name, using his left hand to push the shiny silver handcuffs higher on his skinny wrist to be able to sign. With that, I would like to open it for questions and conversation. Anybody? Thank you again for being here. I hope that this book does justice to the plight of these families and to the torture that our government, in our name, subjected them to. Thank you again, and I'll take any questions. Yes.
Thanks, Efrén. That was amazing. I'm curious if you've been in touch with any of the families since you published the book or while you were writing the book, and how they received, the concept that their stories were going to be publicized.
Yeah, so I've been in touch with, I'm still in touch with some of the families. Certainly the families whose stories are told in full in the book. That is one of the challenges, that some of those families we never saw again. We saw them for 5 minutes that morning and were never able to learn what happened to them. And to this day, some of those families have not been located. But the families whose stories are in the book in full, they were happy to have their story shared. Most of the adults' names are pseudonyms. All of the children's names are pseudonyms. The only names that are there and are true are the same names that had already been published with their consent. One of the families, in fact, wanted a picture to be included in the book without me asking. So one of the pictures that is there is at their request. And it was something with which I struggled as a lawyer in sharing, my former clients' stories in a respectful way, but also in a way that they were okay with and found meaning in. And those families that I couldn't locate and for whom we didn't have consent, they're not included in here. So every single family gave their consent or had previously given their consent. There were some families that we were in touch for a few months back then, and then we lost touch. They, got to their destination, found other representation, and we were not able to find them and locate them again. But it was meaningful to me that they were happy to have their story here. And as you know, in addition to having my mom be able to read the book, I want them to be able to read the book, and until once they learn English, or once the book is translated into Spanish. And that reminds me that if there are any royalties that come from the sales of the book, I will be donating 50% to the families directly. I had been thinking of donating them to an organization like the Texas Civil Rights Project or something, but a former colleague of mine was like, no, give it back to the families, directly to the families. So I was very thankful for that suggestion, and I'm gonna be doing that. Some of the families who were separated have brought lawsuits against the government that are still pending in the courts. Remarkably, this administration is defending that policy and those actions and those officials. So no family to this day has received any sort of compensation. Not that monetary compensation would make them whole. It never will. Some of the families will never be reunited, sadly. But it's at least something that I had perhaps naively been hoping that this administration would do, and it hasn't happened so far. We hope it'll happen soon. Yes.
More about families that have not yet been the children and the parents together?
Yes. The question is, can I speak more about the families that have not been reunited? So, trigger warning, difficult content. I know some families will never be reunited because some parents are no longer with us. As a result of the separation, at least one father died by suicide after being separated from his own child. That child will never see his father again as a result of this policy. Other families, other children remained in the US and their parents were deported. And some of those children are with relatives. Others are in foster care or in shelters. Not many, but some of the parents who were deported have not been able to relocate. And in the aftermath of the separations, the government took the position that the parents had to choose between having the child deported to, say, Honduras, or remain in the US either with a relative or in a shelter or with a foster family. So in the very traumatic moments, weeks after the separation had happened, parents were confronted with this choice, with this impossible choice, which was, I believe, under duress and cannot be considered informed consent in any meaningful way. So many children are not, to this day, not with a parent from whom they were separated.
I think the part where you talk about humanizing through your own experience, like what's happening back there and here, and we all heard Kristen Nielsen and all those people justify it in kind of weird ways, but when you were doing any of this, did you get to talk to any of the agents who are brown people who were doing the like the physical separation? Or could you comment on that? I just find that still completely confusing to me. Like, why didn't they come forward? As you said earlier on, we waited for a Border Patrol agent to say something.
Yeah, it is. I'm trying to come at that question either from the side of why do so many Latino people join the Border Patrol, and sort of all the factors that go into that, which is a complicated situation at the border, lack of other economic opportunities, etc. And the justification of the policy itself and allowing the policy to happen. There's a fantastic article by Caitlin Dickerson with The Atlantic called An American Catastrophe that was out last week. And it is remarkable in showing how mid-level bureaucrats allowed this policy to be implemented and to go into effect, thinking that, oh, somebody will say something. Surely that won't happen. They didn't want to be the ones risking their livelihoods, their careers, their reputation as like civil servants, thinking that somebody else will do that. And the spiral just continued. And these atrocities were allowed to happen by hundreds, if not thousands, of agents and bureaucrats. The other remarkable thing that is easy to forget is that the agents that were carrying out this policy, literally ripping children apart from their mother's hands, are still there. They're still at those stations. Even though we have somebody else in the White House, it's the same agents, the same ICE agents, the same Border Patrol agents. It's the same individuals. So what can we expect, right? If they were doing these things in 2018, how is that possible? In the audio scene, if it's a very difficult audio to watch, to listen to, but there's the voice of an agent speaking to the children, and he's speaking Spanish, and he has a Caribbean accent, so I can't distinguish it among the is he Cuban or Dominican or Puerto Rican, but he has a Caribbean accent, and it turned out the children are Salvadoran. So it brings to mind for me what I was talking about earlier, this arbitrary divisions. Did he see or think of himself as different from the Salvadoran children? Because maybe he was Cuban or Dominican. Why do we ascribe so much meaning to nationalities and to borders, these artificial accidents of history, right? None of us had a choice when it came to what country we wanted to be born in. And it also, that reminds me of another aspect. You know, what makes an American an American? It's not religion. It's not race. We are told that it is adherence to these ideas of justice and equality under the laws, freedom, the rule of law, the rights in the Constitution. But the closer you get to the border, the less and less those ideals stand up. Why is it okay not to have equality under the law, not to have the rule of law when it comes to people knocking at our borders, especially brown and black people? That is, I think, something that, and it's so embedded in the laws. For the lawyers in the room, you will know that, you know, there's this Constitution light zone 70 miles from the border where an agent can come into your backyard without a warrant and without probable cause. That would be unthinkable around here. Think about it. If you live within 25 miles of the border, a federal agent can walk into your backyard with no warrant or no probable cause. Why is that? Why do these ideas that supposedly define this country don't apply near the border? I think there's a question there in the back. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Hey, Efrén.
Hey, Brad.
I actually just wanted to get a sense. I mean, it had been, you mentioned that you were surprised that the current administration was defending the policies. And so that just kind of led me to wonder what the current administration is doing that the previous administration didn't, to actually ensure that the kids are reunited, with as many as possible were reunited.
Yes, that is a great point. And in fairness, this administration created a family reunification task force that has reunited dozens and I think hundreds of families. I couldn't tell you how many were, I know many were reunited with the parents being brought back to the US. Some were reunited back in their home countries. So that has definitely happened. And in that process is that it has come to light the level, and it's hard for me to say if it was just incompetence or just deliberate cruelty in not keeping records, for example, not identifying which child came with which parent. When the children were arriving at the shelters for the caseworkers, it wasn't clear if this 15-year-old had been traveling with a parent or had been traveling alone and crossed the border alone, because there was nothing in the file to distinguish them. We asked at the time how they were keeping track of which child belonged to which parent. And what they told us informally was that they were taking a picture of the family to keep them together. It's like, so putting aside the cross-racial identification problems, which are huge, many of these children were 2 and 3 years old. It's mommy or daddy, right? They don't know their names. And then what? You have a shelter with 200 kids, and it's like, which one's the one on this picture? It was preposterous. So the Biden administration has done a lot to reunite some of the families that remained separated when it took office, and that has been great. And some of them have been reunited in the U.S. In the litigation, it has been a different story, and that the no pun intended, the jury's still out on that. I am worried that 20, 30 years from now, we will see and hear stories of children who learn that, in fact, the people that they thought are their parents are not really their parents, that they were separated in 2018 and grew up with another family, not unlike what's happened in South America after the Argentinian dictatorship, for example. Yes?
Especially for the youngest.
Oh,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you think things will change, if you're hopeful in the future, and what do you think will change the situation, the conditions for folks affected? What in your mind?
the question is whether I am hopeful and whether I think things will change and get better in the future. I am an eternal optimist. Otherwise, I couldn't do this work. I believe that if we continue pushing, we will be able to make a difference, frankly. What I've also learned is that it is not a matter of who is in office that will make a difference. It's got to be a matter of the masses pushing against these ideas and these policies. It's not going to be in the courts. It may be at the ballot box, but it's not going to be in the courts anytime soon that we're going to be able to change things for the better. It's got to be the people power. Those of us who believe that this country has the potential to be a true multiracial democracy keep pushing for that every step of the way and in every area of the work and of our lives, from our children's education to our social circles to the ballot box. So I will always believe in a better tomorrow.
I thought we were putting someone in government that would do just that. Maybe that's naive, but I thought that's what was happening.
Yeah. Yes.
When I'm thinking about reunification, I think about the wee children who aren't even able to speak, much less identify their parents. Have they used some like DNA or anything, any other measures to find and reunify and unify parents with kids under those circumstances, or any other circumstances for that matter?
So the question of DNA is always a dicey question, because everything, as you can imagine, everything that goes into a government database is then into every government database, right? So I will never be advocating for DNA from anyone without their informed consent. There was a family that I talk about in the book who were separated after the executive order was signed that was supposed to have ended family separations. A young man from Guatemala and his daughter under 3 years old. And he was accused of having of smuggling his own daughter. He had a birth certificate, a copy of her birth certificate, but they didn't believe him. They claimed it was a forgery. He didn't speak Spanish. They didn't provide, the Border Patrol agents did not provide an interpreter of his indigenous language. So partly lost in translation, partly not believing the document that he had. They ended up separating them. And to bring them back together, they required a DNA test. Even after we had provided certification from the Guatemalan consulate that this was, in fact, a legitimate birth certificate showing his name as a father and her name as a daughter, they still wanted DNA. And they threatened with charging him with smuggling if the test came back negative. So he's in a detention facility in South Texas. The daughter is 800 miles away in El Paso with a temporary foster family so that it's as normal as possible. And now we're faced with this possibility, right, that he might be facing up to 10 years in prison if the DNA test were to come back negative, if we do the DNA test. So I remember talking to his sister-in-law who was in Georgia asking about this. and asking her, it's like they want to draw blood from Mario to confirm that he's in fact the father. It's like, oh yeah, no, he's a father. That's fine. Like, are you sure? Is there any possibility that he raised her, but she's not biologically his? Is it possible that she's not his daughter and not even he knows it? There were so many reasons. I mean, familias de crianza, for those of you from Latin America, are very common in many Latin American countries, where it's not uncommon to raise nephew or a niece or a family friend. There are so many reasons why that could happen, and the DNA test would come back negative. And to top it all off, then the laboratories did not want to work with the government, sort of boycotting them because of the family separation policy. So that made it even harder to get the DNA test. And at the time, we brought an interpreter and had a conversation with the father about this and what it would entail. And we cared very much that he also give his consent for the DNA test for his daughter. The government took the position that since she was in federal custody, Health and Human Services could make medical decisions, so that they didn't need his consent. We still got his consent, and they, after a month of being separated, they took the DNA test. And you want the spoiler or no? Chapter 8.
I was in charge of the juvenile court in Springfield, Illinois. And in all of these children's cases, the first thing you ask is what's in the best interest of the child. You don't ask what's in the best interest of the parent. So while I'm sympathetic with what you're saying, I also think that figuring out what this baby or young child needs should be paramount as you're analyzing the issue.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I consider myself a human rights lawyer. I know there are human rights lawyers in the room. And the best interest of the child was the very first argument that we used when we went to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It's the guiding principle for any governmental decision that affects the life of a child. It was nowhere to be found when the family separation policy came into place, of course. And I do think that, I mean, there are many exceptions, but where you typically start to determine what is in the best interest of a child is their immediate family members. But I'm not sure I understand where you're going, the point of that question with respect to the DNA test.
Well, if the person is not the father, what are the implications? I don't know, but I do think that there is a legitimate state interest in figuring out what the implications are, and making sure that they're not putting together the child with somebody who really isn't a parental figure.
Certainly, yes. And that argument was raised in one of the litigations, and the court called it a solution looking for a problem. Because of 5,000 families that were separated, I know of 2 in which that was an issue, right? So it is putting, I don't know the expression, if it's putting the cart before the horse or a solution looking for a problem, but it's used certainly as an excuse by the proponents of the policy, right? That they were protecting the children. But the vast majority, over 99% of the families, are in fact who they say they are. And there was no DNA testing on the front end. They were requiring it on the back end to reunite. So as I said, the DNA extraction issue is not as straightforward.
Hi, first I want to thank you so much, not only for your work, but for documenting it. I'm an ELL teacher here in DC, so this is particularly close to the heart of the students and the families that I work with. I'd like to hear a little bit about what prompted you to write a book, and if there's any thoughts lingering in the back of your mind about doing like a young adult version. It made me, as you were talking and reflecting about your own stories, thinking of another Efrén Divided, in the Pablo Cartaya young adult novel. And that story is a young boy whose mother is deported. And your story, I feel like, is one that we don't see in literature, of someone whose parent was gone because they were working, and so that different kind of family separation that you describe. And so I'm wondering what prompted you to start having those reflections and write the book, and if you're maybe thinking in the back of your mind of how young readers can also access the story.
Well, now I am. So I'll take the second question first. Somebody, in one of the reviews of the book, they included a young adult recommendation that young adults will appreciate it to understand immigration policy better. And I had never thought of this book as a young adult book. I think it's too heavy for teenagers. It could be traumatizing, I suppose. But now you've planted that seed in my head, whether there's another version for it. As to what prompted me to write the book, so when we were doing this work in 2018, never crossed my mind. What crossed my mind, and I was sharing this with one of my friends, that there were a couple of stories and situations that happened that I was like, we need to capture this, document this somehow. This cannot be lost to only oral stories and oral histories, like the story of Mario that I was sharing. It encapsulated so much that is wrong with our immigration laws and system that I felt they were so valuable. We got to tell that story somehow. And, you tell it in the media and in that kind of advocacy and the reporting around it, but I felt that there was a lot more. And it was not until I was giving that talk to college students that somebody said, it's like, you should put this together into a book. There's something here. And I started to see the parallels with my own experience that I thought could be end up being a book. In writing the book, so I have 3 older siblings who are half siblings, only on my dad's side of the family, and kind of thinking about my family story and what had happened, I like one day talking to my sisters, like, oh, I when they were little, their parents, my dad and their mom, separated, and my dad brought them from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. And overnight, my 10-year-old brother, he was at the time 10, my sister was 7, and my other sister 3. They never saw their mom again for like 7 years. So I'm talking to my sister, and I'm like, I'm just now hitting me that what you all went through, that was another type of family separation. She's like, yes. So she had thought of it always as a family separation, and I had never thought of it. So I thought it was meaningful to include that piece of my family story as another variation of family separation that very much marks who you become, and in some cases scars you for the rest of your life. The last piece of that is, now I have 2 children. They're 5 and 2. I hope that one day they will read it. But I don't think it will be when they'll be teenagers. I think. Yes.
Sir, thank you. Why is our immigration system so fouled up?
This policy, this law, the illegal entry law, the statute that was used to prosecute the parents and take their children away, has been in the books since 1929. And the reasons given back then why Congress passed that law was so that not so many Mexicans would be coming, because this was a white country. It's in the legislative history. That's why the law was passed, because too many people were coming from Europe and from Mexico. Every piece of our immigration law that is exclusive, that limits who can come in, if you look at the history, you can trace it back to some racist, xenophobic attempt to keep people out. Now, today, we try to reconcile that with jurisprudence and with our contemporary vision of human rights, and it doesn't always jive. It doesn't always work. I am convinced that our immigration laws and system is so fouled up because at its very root, it's designed as a racist system. Yes.
Would you be able to tell us a little more about how civil liberties kind of break down increasingly as you get closer to the border? You made a point about that earlier. Would you be able to expand on that a bit?
Sure. So the first cutoff point is 70 miles from the border. There are immigration checkpoints at every road or highway coming north from the border. And there you are stopped and you're asked if you're a U.S. citizen or for your immigration status. That cannot happen in the interior of the country. That has been challenged in courts, and since 1976, the Supreme Court said that is fine because you're close to the border. It's a national security issue. Within 25 miles of the border, as I was saying earlier, federal agents have the right to go into private property, not private dwellings, right? So they cannot come into your home, but they can come into your backyard or front yard, cross your fence for the purpose of patrolling the border. That's 25 miles of the river or the border and other parts of the border. Entire cities lie within that border. The entire city of San Diego, of El Paso, are within that 25 miles swath. And it's been upheld that that is fine for the purpose of patrolling who comes into the border. These laws and these doctrines are, again, rooted in this idea of excluding who we want to allow as Americans. Yeah.
All right, if there are no more questions, first and foremost, a massive round of applause for this incredible talk.
Thank you.
And if everyone could do us a great favor.